Good morning, brothers and sisters. Yeah. So, Thanksgiving is upon us. Are you ready? Okay. So I have a little quiz this morning, and hopefully you get 100%. It's an easy one. Let's see if it comes up here. Thanksgiving. What's it all about? Is it about Columbus in 1492? Yes? No? No. Is it about Jamestown in 1607? No, it's not Jamestown. Is it about Plymouth in 1620? Yes! Okay, you got that one right. Good job. Okay. So what about this? Pilgrim. When you see the word pilgrim, what do you think of? Yeah, guys in the black and white, right? These folks. Yeah. Or you might think of that guy. I still like those Charlie Brown movies. But I'm going to pop your bubble, at least for some of you. This is what the pilgrims really looked like. The pilgrims didn't wear the black hats and the buckles and the black and white and the shoes with the buckles and all that kind of stuff. That came much later from some magazine editor or something. I don't even have the history on that. But this is what your pilgrim forefathers or foremothers, depending on how you look at it, looked like. I'm talking about the one in the dress, not the ones up front. Here's another guy. That would be a traditional work outfit for a pilgrim. And this would be maybe a leader in the colony. This gentleman is actually portraying, I believe, William Brewster. All right. These shots are being taken at the Plymouth Plantation in Plymouth, Massachusetts. All right. Well, I got to tell you, Thanksgiving is my favorite holiday. It truly is. I actually enjoy Thanksgiving more than I do Christmas or Easter or any other time. And I think the reason for it is that it's less commercial. You know, it's one of those holidays where a lot of the world or a lot of our country kind of goes, oh yeah, we'll eat food, but on we go to Christmas. And so they haven't over-commercialized it yet, and I really appreciate that because it allows me to truly keep it spiritual. And even though it's a civil holiday, it is so spiritual at its root that it's a precious holiday to me. But, you know, when I think of Thanksgiving, I also think of turkey and of course, parades. Love the parades. Got to get up in time for those. And, of course, there's the football, right? Yeah. Okay. The Thanksgiving holiday and the story behind it is fairly familiar to those of us who have grown up in American schools, although we may not know as much as we think we know about it because of incorrect traditions like these, you know, black and white buckle things, or in many cases, revisionist history. If you've grown up in gone to a secular school growing up and been in a history class, no doubt you've missed a lot of what I'm going to share with you today. And of course, those who have grown up in other countries, especially non-European countries, may not have a clue what this holiday is about other than the turkey and the parades and the football. So, I'd like to share with you about these pilgrims, what they accomplished. They've had an extraordinary impact on our nation. It's estimated that there are 35 million people in the world right now that are descendants of the pilgrims. And if you consider, and I'll talk about this later, but there were 102 that came over on the boat, but half of them died in the first 90 days. So if you consider that, you're only talking about 50 people, and some of those are married, to have 35 million descendants throughout the world. That is a heritage. And some of their descendants are pretty famous. Presidents Bush, 41 and 43, FDR, Taft, Zachary Taylor, John Adams, and John Quincy Adams are all descendants. And yet, these people who have had quite an impact on our country are ordinary people, just like you and me. I've had the opportunity, God's granted me the great privilege to, in addition to what I'm doing here, to kind of have a little side gig. I work for a company called American Christian Tours, and I'm I'm called an educational program leader, but it's basically a tour guide. And so I fly back to the East Coast every once in a while. I don't do it much because my responsibilities are so great here. But every once in a while I'll fly back, and I'll meet with a school group, and I will take them all up and down the East Coast and get them in the hotels and restaurants and all that kind of thing. But I also take them to all the sites, and I teach them the history of each site from a Christian biblical perspective. And it's such a privilege for me to do that. And I've been able to go to Plymouth probably about 10 times over the last 10 years or so. And I've really grown to appreciate these very precious, extraordinary people. And I'd like to share a little of this with you this morning in preparation for this great celebration. The last 2 Sundays, Pastor Hector's been teaching us about freedom. And our key verse has been from the book of John, where it says, "Then Jesus said to those Jews who believed him, 'If you abide in my word, you are my disciples indeed, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. Therefore, if the Son makes you free, you shall be free indeed.'" And I think you'll find today that our pilgrim forefathers sought and found this freedom that Jesus is describing, both internal freedom and also external freedom. And they're examples for us today. When we look at historical figures, we tend to look at them kind of like characters in a movie. I don't know if you can relate to that at all. You know, when I absolutely love history now, but when I was in high school in history, I barely got C minuses. You know, because it was all taught, names, dates, this war and that war and this, and it just didn't jive with me because there was no connection between them, and it didn't seem relevant to me at all. And besides, I was too occupied looking at girls, at that point. And so, I don't know if you can relate to it, but historical figures do tend to be kind of like characters in a movie. They're kind of detached from us and kind of outside of ourselves. They're kind of two-dimensional and not real. And they kind of have lives and a story that kind of, like a movie, kind of begins with the opening trailer and ends with the credits, but not connected to anything before or after. And you kind of get left hanging. But in fact, history is actually a continuum of people and events that chain together to form a big story. And it's not our story as human beings. It's God's story. It's His story. And that's why we call it His story. History. His story. And it's a big story that God prepared before creation, and He will accomplish, in eternity. But He's created this thing called space and time that He has placed us human beings into. And He has a big story that He's carrying out. And that story is a story of redemption and deliverance from the works of darkness. And we're all players in that story, if you will. Every one of us with a complete free will, and yet a very specific part to play that was orchestrated from the foundations of the world. It's a little hard for me, if you'll forgive me. I'm going to pick up my notes because it's too hard to read like this type of thing. So if you'll bear with me. Okay. Historical figures, whether famous, infamous, or unknown, are as real and as ordinary as you and me. They have problems, they have faults, they have desires, they have everyday responsibilities. They were people who, if we allow ourselves to, we can empathize with and easily relate to. And I'd encourage you today to kind of go beyond the screen, go beyond my message, and kind of get into that third dimension with these people that I'll be sharing with sharing about today. Kind of get into their skin for a moment and try to think what they thought and feel what they felt and understand why they made the decisions they did. Actually. So what makes ordinary people extraordinary? Well, generally it's the extraordinary circumstances that are cast upon them or the consequences of their choices and how they responded to these circumstances as a reflection of their character and their worldview. Their ideas and their resulting choices have consequences. So how are we responding to our extraordinary circumstances? Any of you feel like you've had some extraordinary circumstances recently that you've had to face? How are we responding to those? Are we living lives that future generations would reflect back upon our lives as being extraordinary, born out of a committed Christian character and a comprehensive biblical worldview? How would history look back upon us? Because really, we are historical figures. Have you ever thought about that? We are making history even today as we sit here. So we are historical figures. And we are ordinary, but we can be extraordinary. I've had the privilege of getting to know a gentleman named Marshall Foster, Dr. Marshall Foster. He's the head of the World History Institute. Used to be the Mayflower Institute, so he knows a tremendous amount about these Puritans, and I've learned a lot from him. And he speaks of something called the chain of liberty, which is God's hand in history to bring freedom to mankind. And that chain began back in the Garden of Eden and will continue until the end of time. And today I'm going to give you kind of a fairly small segment of that and talk about that in order to give context for what we're going to be talking about a little bit later. The first chain or link in the chain that I'm going to talk about happens in 1455 with the printing of the Gutenberg Bible. Now, a lot of people say that Gutenberg invented the printing press, but in fact, he did not. Printing press was invented in China back in about 300 AD. But they used block printing. What made Gutenberg's press unique was movable type and the ability to print hundreds or thousands of copies of a book. So in 1455, one of the first books, maybe even the first book that Gutenberg printed on his press was the Bible. And when that took place, that just totally opened up the culture of the world. We went from the Dark Ages into, if you will, an enlightened period at that point, because now people could have the Word of God for themselves. They could hear the voice of God through His Word, rather than getting it interpreted by somebody else. The next link in the chain is in 1517 when we have Martin Luther hammering those 95 theses on the church door at Wittenberg Castle in Germany. And this was the beginning spark of the Protestant Reformation. Then the next link in the chain is William Tyndale in 1526. He took Gutenberg's press, he took the Protestant Reformation, and he decided to provide the English people with a Bible in the English language for the first time in history. Then in 1533, we have Henry VIII. And every time I hear that name, for you older folks, I'm Henry VIII, I am Henry, yeah, right. Oh, Herman's Hermits, right? But Henry VIII was a real character, and he needed an heir to the throne, but his wife couldn't give him an heir, so he wanted to divorce her. But unfortunately, the Pope wouldn't permit him to do so. So he said, well, enough of this. If you won't allow me to do it, hey, I'm king, I should be able to do anything I want. I'm going to break totally away from the Catholic Church and create a new church in England called the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. And I'm going to be the head of that church, so I get to say what happens. And So because of that break from the Catholic Church, at that point, the Reformation that started in Germany officially came into England. But not so fast. It was Reformation, but it wasn't with the freedoms that come with it. Then the next link in the chain is in 1547, a gentleman named Edward VI. He was heir to the throne after Henry, and he was actually a Protestant and was very pro-Protestant, if you will. And so that was kind of a nice time in the history of England. The problem is he was a boy king, and he didn't last very long. He only lasted about 5 or 6 years. Then next on the throne was a gal named Mary the First, I believe, who's affectionately called Bloody Mary. And Bloody Mary was actually Catholic. And when she came on the throne, she decided, no, we're not going to be Protestant around here. England's going to be Catholic. And she put effort behind her words, and there was a lot of persecution that took place against the Protestants in England at the time, and many of them had to flee in exile over to Europe. And some of them went into Switzerland to Geneva and came under the teaching of John Calvin, and were exposed to the newly printed Geneva Bible and Fox's Book of Martyrs. And they were inspired by that. Then after Bloody Mary, we have Elizabeth I, and Elizabeth says, no, I'm a Protestant, so now we're going to be a Protestant nation again. Yeah, they had religious whiplash going on in England. It was hard to figure out what side of or whether you were in favor or in the favor of the crown or against it, and whether you should hide or what. But anyway, Queen Elizabeth assumed the throne, and the exiles that went over to Geneva, they returned with their newfound beliefs. And they enthusiastically welcomed her promotion of Protestantism, but they were disappointed by her lack of reforms. Because you see, the Anglican Church, really in many respects, mirrored the Catholic Church. They still had the bishops and the priests and and all the liturgy and all the things that were still part of the Catholic Church. They hadn't really done any reforming of the Anglican Church. But these people who had been exiled to Switzerland, they came back and they wanted reform because they'd experienced something new when they were in Switzerland. And then something happened during the time of Elizabeth's reign, and this is kind of a little side note, but it's very important. It's something called the Spanish Armada in 1588. And you didn't know you were getting a history lesson today, right? You probably thought you were going to get preaching. Well, if you'll bear with me today, I hope you'll be inspired in spite of my history lesson. So in 1588, the King of Spain, who was Catholic, said, oh, those English, this Protestantism, I can't even say it. You understand what I mean. It's a bad thing. We need to take England back and make it Catholic again. So he sent 130 ships, about 130 ships, all at one time in a mass armada to attack England. And by a great miracle of God, and it truly was a miracle of God, there was all kinds of prayer going on, and the English Navy was much smaller than the Armada. But through Sir Francis Drake was one of the head ship captains. Some things that he did, which were really smart, but really because of the providence of God, who brought in massive storms, almost the entire fleet was wiped out by those massive storms. The hand of God. And because of that, Spain, who ruled the waves up to that time, and they were the ones, having all the settlements, exploring and everything else, that put an end to their exploring and their settlements, and it opened up the ability to have settlements and such for the English. Now the English ruled the waves, and because of that, our country became English-based, if you will. If it wasn't for the defeat of the Spanish Armada, we'd all be speaking Spanish today. So, and be Catholic, for that matter. Then there was James the First. After Elizabeth, she reigned like 50 years. After her reign came James the First. And he is the James of the King James Bible. He reigned and he began in 1603. But even though he claimed to be a Protestant, he was a tyrant. He was called the Tyrant King on steroids. He was the foremost proponent of what's called the divine right of kings. And what that means is the king isn't subject to man's authority and laws and accountability, but only directly to God himself as his representative to both the state and the church. So basically, he can do whatever he wants. He's above the law. And he considered himself to be a devout Protestant Christian while he obsessed with hunting down and destroying the most devout people in his land. So, under Elizabeth's reign, we'll back up a few years, there were some who sought extensive reform and sought to purify the Anglican Church. And this was the beginning of what's called Puritanism, because they wanted to purify the English church. But the Puritans were willing to accept things as they were and remain in the church till reforms might eventually happen. They weren't willing to break the law and leave the church. But then there were other Puritans, a specific group of Puritans called separatists. And these separatists were concerned with long delay in reform, and they decided upon what was called a reformation without tarrying for any. They weren't going to wait around. They wanted change now or they're out of here. And they felt actually the Puritans were wrong to wait and to accept error in the church. So these separatists refused to accept or be associated with the state church with all its trappings and all its problems. And they began to form voluntary congregations based on a covenant with God and with each other. And they sought a more simple, pure, unrestrained zeal to worship God according to the dictates of their own conscience. They believed that true churches should allow people to join by their own free will and be independent of ecclesiastical organization. This was the beginning of what's called congregational churches. And they believed that churches should be made up of those who are sincerely saved and committed to Christ and are willing to make a covenant or commitment to each other. Because you understand, with the Church of England, everybody was a member of the Church of England, regardless of whether they had any kind of relationship with Christ or not. And they would call themselves a Christian because they were a member of the Church of England. But the separatists understood that no, there's more to it than that, and the true church should be made up of those people who have made a commitment to Christ. So it's hard for us to realize how incredibly radical this idea of separatism was, because it's so normal for us today. We've reaped the fruit of their efforts from 400 years ago. But a national church is what held their society together for 1,000 years. And to separate from the church, they had the king as its head, was more than just changing a denomination. It was heresy against the crown. So it was a big deal what they were doing, and they risked a lot to stand for the Lord and to worship him according to their conscience. There's a book that I absolutely love. It's a little difficult to read if you try and read it in the original language, but they have English translation, modern English translations now, and it's called Of Plymouth Plantation. It's William Bradford's history of the Plymouth settlement from 1608 to 1650. And if you ever want to find out more about what I'm talking about today, I highly recommend the book. It was written in 1630 to 1651, and it's regarded as the most authoritative account of the Pilgrims in the early years of the colony. And in my message today, I'll be using a number of quotes from William Bradford. So if you see a quote up on the screen and there's no name next to it, you can assume that it's William Bradford. So these separatists began meeting in secret in a little town in the northern part of England called Scrooby, in a place called Scrooby Manor. And the the caretaker of Scrooby Manor, the guy who actually lived there, was a guy named William Brewster. And they began meeting in 1602, some neighbors, and they had to meet as an underground church. Now, underground church, I hope you understand, that doesn't mean they met underground. It means they met in secret, right? And William Brewster became an elder at Scrooby, and then when they went to Holland, and also was their spiritual leader at Plymouth until they actually got a pastor. They didn't have a pastor in Plymouth in the beginning years. There's another gentleman you should know about. His name is John Robinson. He came in and was the pastor for this secret Scrooby congregation. He actually was a trained clergyman in the Church of England, but he was kicked out of his position because he refused to wear the vestments, the clerical robes, and he refused to preach the appointed homilies that the crown wanted them to teach. He wanted to actually preach the Word of God. So he was kicked out of his position, and he came and joined the Scrooby Church. And in 1606, the church officially formed the Separatist Church of Scrooby, and they wrote a church covenant affirming church self-government apart from the official church. That's the first time in the history of the world that had ever happened. You mean you have the audacity to think that you can actually voluntarily create your own church? It was unheard of at the time, but they did. And because they had been exposed to the Calvinist teaching in Geneva, they understood what's called covenant relationships. And so, which means they make a contract, a commitment to each other. And so, this is what Bradford said. Those reformers who saw the evil of these things and whose hearts the Lord had touched with heavenly zeal for his truth shook off this yoke of anti-Christian bondage, and as the Lord's free people joined themselves together by covenant as a church in the fellowship of the gospel to walk in all his ways made known, or to be made known to them, according to their best endeavors, whatever it should cost them, the Lord assisting them. There's another gentleman you should know about, and that's William Bradford. And he actually joined the congregation, the Scrooby congregation, as a child. He became orphaned when he was very young, as both his parents died, and he was brought up by relatives. And in a period of time when he was really sick in bed, he spent all this extended period reading the Bible. And the Holy Spirit began to talk to him and minister to him and open up his eyes and his heart. And then he was drawn to the Scrooby congregation, their fervor for reform. And by age 17, he was a fully committed member. And he becomes important later on because when they come over to the Plymouth colony, he becomes their governor for 30 out of 36 years. He was a well-respected man, and he was like the number one guy in the colony. But he started as a 12-year-old in this Scrooby church. So this underground church, they met in secret by candlelight for 4 years with the children acting as lookouts. Yeah, thank you, Meg. And this was really tough to carry on a church service when you had to be quiet. You want to worship the Lord, you want to speak out his word, but you have to be really quiet. And you got the kids up in the rafters and looking out the windows and down the lane and coming and telling you if somebody's coming. And that's just really hard. So they reached a point where they had to make a choice. Either they were going to be all in where they were, recognize that they were eventually going to get caught, or they needed to escape and make a strategic retreat from England. But by doing so, the motive would be to grow and develop as a community of faith, but also to one day come back to England to set their friends, families, the church, and the entire nation free from this tyrant. So they made the choice to leave. Feeling constrained by God to leave their native soil, as we're reading through this, I've underlined some things. Think of all that they gave up. And it reminds me a little bit of Abraham, where God said, leave your people, leave your country, leave all these things and go to a place that I will show you. Feeling constrained by God to leave their native soil and country, their lands and possessions, and all their friends and familiar acquaintances, it was thought to be a hard and unbelievable choice by many people. But in addition to that, to also go into a country that they didn't know much about, which was Holland, except by rumors, where they must learn a new language and earn a living when they didn't know how they would do it, it being a pleasant place, but subject to the miseries of war with Spain. They had just come out of a war with Spain and could go back into a war with Spain at any time. It was by many thought an adventure almost desperate, a case intolerable, and a misery worse than death, especially seeing that they were not acquainted with business and commerce by which that country survives, but they had only been used to a plain country life and the innocent trade of farming. But these things, and you'll see this repeated again and again, their attitude about trials and tribulations and hopelessness and everything else, and they come back to it and say, no big deal, because God's in control. But these things did not overly discourage them, though they did sometimes trouble them, for their desires were set on the ways of God and to enjoy His ordinances, His laws, His precepts, to enjoy them. But they rested on His providence, and providence in this time period means God's control and perfect plan. And they knew whom they had believed. So they started making attempts to leave England and to go to Holland. The problem is that they were forbidden to do so by the crown. And so they were in a tough spot because on one hand they were forbidden to worship freely, and yet they were forbidden to leave so they could worship freely. So they had to do everything in secret. And at their first attempt, they hired an English sea captain to pick them up at a certain place, to meet them at a certain place, a certain time, and load all their goods on, everything else. So they came to the place of meeting, and the ship captain was delayed 2 or 3 days, and they were kind of scratching their head going, what's going on here? But finally, the ship captain came, and they got on board. They got all their possessions on board, and as soon as they did that, out came army, magistrates, representatives of the government, forced them off the ship. Their goods were still on the ship. Forced them off the ship into little boats. And while they were on the little boats, they totally searched them up and down for any kind of money or possessions or anything they could find, including the women, by the way. Mr. Bradford says beyond modesty for the women. And after they searched them, then they took them back to the town and made a public spectacle of them in front of the other citizens, kind of marched them through town, and then put them in prison. They were in prison for a few months. That was their first attempt. And you would think at that point they'd kind of throw up their hands and go, this isn't working. I don't know if we can do this. Well, no, they tried again, although it was a smaller group the second time. There was a second attempt about a year later, and there was a smaller group, and they made arrangements with a Dutch sea captain this time because they couldn't trust the English sea captains. So they made arrangements with the Dutch sea captain, and the Dutch sea captain promised to be faithful to them and not, give them a hard time, or not, turn them in or anything. And again, they made arrangements to meet at a certain place at a certain time. But this time, what they did is they took the women and the children and their possessions and put them on a boat, on a small ship, and sent that ship down the river Trent, while the men went overland to the meeting place. And the idea was as if one group or the other got caught, maybe the other group would get away. So the children went one way, men went the other way. Well, the women and children had no problem at all. They made it down the river into the bay, and when they got into the bay, the seas were really rough, and they started getting seasick. And so they begged the person who was handling the boat, please, let's just go in. Let's go in and wait. And so he relented. The problem was that the tide was down. They got stuck in the mud, and they couldn't move. So they were stuck all night. So the next day, they're still stuck. And of course, if they get out of the boat, they couldn't walk. Okay, so they're truly stuck. They've got to wait for the water to rise. Well, in the meantime, the men show up on the shore, and the Dutch ship comes and arrives, and half the men get on the ship, and they're waiting for the water to rise, and all of a sudden, who arrives? The army, the local magistrates, everybody else arrives. Somehow they found out about it. The Dutch ship captain, he was afraid of losing his ship, and so he cried out his nation's motto, which is Sacramente! And he pulled up the anchor and started sailing away. Well, the men who were on the boat were in great distress because all they had were the clothes on their back. They had no money or very little money between them, and besides, their wives and children were stuck on the shore, and they knew that they were going to be put in prison and that they weren't going to be there to assist their families. So these were pretty rough times for these people. Then it didn't end there. These guys who did make it on the boat wished they hadn't gone on the boat, but now they were captive. They started heading towards Holland, and a big storm arose. And we're talking the mother of all storms here. Okay, it was huge. And it should have only taken a couple days to get to Holland. It took 14 days. 7 of those days, then it didn't see the sun, the moon, or the stars. And they were tossed around so much that the sailors, the experienced sailors, were shrieking and crying out, sure that they were going to be lost. And at one point, in fact, the ship actually capsized. It totally capsized, turned over, and was covered by the sea, and they were sinking without hope of recovery. Now, I'll pick up the story with William Bradford. Oops. Did I get ahead of myself here? Oh. Okay, well, maybe I'm reading it. Okay, sorry. So, but when man's hope and help totally failed, the Lord's power and mercy appeared in their recovery. For the ship rose again and gave the mariners courage again to manage her. You understand, this ship was upside down underneath the water, and it rose back up again. And at the risk of sounding like I'm bragging, I would like to tell you about the fervent prayers of the separatists as they cried out to the Lord in this great distress. Some of them were hardly distracted when the water ran into their mouths and ears, and the mariners cried out, "We sink! We sink!" These separatists cried out, if not with miraculous, at least with a great height or degree of divine faith, "Yet, Lord, you can still save us. Yet, Lord, you can still save us." And with such other expressions as I will not share at the moment. When they did this, not only did the ship recover, but shortly after this, the violence of the storms began to calm down. And the Lord filled their afflicted minds with such comforts that most people cannot understand. And in the end, brought them to their desired destination and rest, where the people came flocking to see them in the ship, admiring that they had been delivered. The storm having been so long and horrible that much damage had been done, as the ship captain's friends told him in their congratulations. There were over 100 ships that were destroyed in that storm. Theirs was the only one that survived. You think God's hand wasn't upon these people? You think God is not involved in our affairs, the affairs of his people? We serve a mighty God. So Bradford says there are other untold stories of troubles and hardships and significant journeys which they endured, but he's not going to bore us with those. But what he does say is that through these trials that they went through, yes, there were some of the separatists that lost heart, they lost faith, and they kind of backed away from their faith, or at least kind of went in hiding a little bit. But he said that their troubles and trials became so public and so well known in England that people were taking notice. They were going, who are these people? What? Are these people crazy? Well, they're always so hopeful and joyful, even in the midst of all this persecution. What is this thing that they're experiencing? And it created a real hungering and thirsting for what they had. And it turned out that there were many, many more people that actually, in the midst of persecution, actually came and joined them as separatists and came over to Holland to join them there because of their persecution. I think that's awesome. When they got to Holland, they started out in Amsterdam for about a year, and then they went to a little town called Leiden. And Holland was fair and beautiful and flowing with abundance of wealth and riches. And Leiden was a university town with many educated and scholarly people. And this was the only country in the world at that time that had religious toleration. All the other countries were either Catholic or Protestant and fighting each other over that. And so this was the only place that they could go that actually had religious toleration. But it was a good place, but the separatists struggled continuously with poverty because they weren't part of the guilds. If you know what the guilds are. You know, the various trades. You have to go through an apprenticeship program to be a part of trades. And they were farmers, and they couldn't go through the guilds, and so they couldn't get the jobs that would allow them to survive. And often their children had to work just to eat, just for them to eat and survive. But they did have a good reputation and witness for Christ. The Dutch merchants would trust them when the separatists were lacking for money. They could still go ahead and purchase, on loan or on credit, because the shopkeepers knew that the separatists were going to be good for it. They were painfully diligent in their jobs. And because of that, the Dutch shop owners would strive to not only get their business, but also employ them above others because of their honesty and diligence. Another thing that happened while they were in Leiden is they set up a printing press in William Brewster's home, and they printed hundreds, maybe even thousands copies of 15 different books that were evangelistic in nature, and they put them in kegs and smuggled them back to England in order to evangelize their mother country. That only lasted about a year and a half, and then King James heard about it and had the printing press destroyed. But this scripture really exemplifies the heart and the passion of these separatists that we now call pilgrims. It's from Matthew chapter 5, verses 14 through 16. It says, "You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven." So they were in Holland for about 12 years. But then they evaluated their current situation and evaluated what their future was going to look like. Life was hard there. They were getting old kind of prematurely because of all the hard labor and everything. And they decided that they needed to depart once again. They needed to find another home. And there were many serious and solid reasons, Bradford says, for this, but he points out 3 of them, and I'd like to share them with you. Except I'm getting ahead of myself. Stop it. Okay. So the first reason was the hardness of living in Holland and how that hindered those in England from joining them in their afflictions of poverty. There were still separatists in England that could have come over to join them in Holland, but they weren't willing to do so. They would rather stay in bondage in England than suffer the hardship that their friends were suffering in Holland. So they felt like if they could move to another place, it was more, easier to live at, that maybe more of their friends would come. The second reason was the separatists saw that their children and future generations would be in danger of degeneration and becoming corrupted. Due to their living conditions and the great immorality of the Dutch youth and the variety of temptations and evil examples, Bradford says, many of their children were drawn away from the faith and their congregation into extravagant and dangerous lifestyles, getting the reins off their necks and leaving their parents. They became soldiers. At that time, that was, not a good thing, I guess. Became soldiers, sailors, and worse lifestyles, tending towards loose morals and behavior to the danger of their souls, causing great grief to their parents and leading to the dishonor of God. And the third reason that Bradford gives is this. Lastly, and not the least, they had a great hope and inward zeal of laying a good foundation, or at least making progress towards laying a good foundation, for the spreading and advancement of the gospel of the kingdom of Christ in the remote parts of the world. Yes, though they should be only stepping stones for others in future generations to perform so great a work. They were missionaries. They had a vision to evangelize the Native Americans. And certainly other colonists that would come over, but at that time, there weren't that many colonies around, to evangelize. They're talking about going over and evangelizing the Native Americans. So the place that they were considering moving to was some of the vast and unpopulated areas of America, as Bradford says. And it was said to be fruitful and fit for habitation, but there were a few problems. There were few civil inhabitants. And this is Bradford's words. I don't mean to be politically incorrect or offend anybody, but if you'll bear with me, I'm just quoting what Bradford says. He said, "There are only savage and violent men which have no permanent dwellings, but travel up and down the land, differing little from the wild beasts. There's a continual danger of the savage people who are cruel, barbarous, and most treacherous, being most furious in their rage and merciless when they overcome others, not being content to just kill and take away life, but also take delight in tormenting their victims. They're likely to experience famine, nakedness, and the lack of all things. And the change of air, diet, and drinking water would infect their bodies with great sickness and terrible diseases. And they didn't have enough money to pay for such a voyage and to buy all of the supplies that they would need. And how would their supplies be replenished in the future after they arrive? And besides, there were many previous experiences of poor success and regrettable miseries, as he says, at other colonies, which would be like the Roanoke colony, the lost colony of Roanoke, and also Jamestown colony, where they had the starving time and had to go, resort to cannibalism. It was hard enough moving to and adjusting to Holland, which was civilized. This would be much harder. This is the understatement. This caused many fears and doubts. You think? Can you imagine? Can you imagine looking at a brochure, a travel brochure to go someplace, and it lists all these, great things. There'll be savages who will not only kill you, they'll torment you as they're doing it. Enjoy yourself. But this is once again how Bradford responded. But the leaders and wisest in the group, of course he's one of them, answered these concerns by saying that all great and honorable actions are accompanied with great difficulties. Duh. And these actions and difficulties must be both attempted and overcome with responsible and appropriate courage. It was granted that the dangers would be great, but not hopeless. The difficulties were many, but not unbeatable. All of them through the help of God, by fortitude and patience, might either be accepted or overcome. Incredible people. So, they made the choice to leave. They left Holland on a boat called the Speedwell that they hired. And John Robinson didn't go with them. Their beloved pastor didn't go with them. He stayed back in Holland with actually the majority of the separatists who didn't go. It was actually a minority of the separatists that actually went over to the New World. And so they had a goodbye party and an all-day prayer session, and then they left on the Speedwell. Well, as the Speedwell was heading to England, they found out that the Speedwell didn't have speed and it wasn't well. In fact, it sprung a leak. So they were supposed to bring the Speedwell over to England, where the Mayflower would be there, and also some additional separatists from England would be joining them. So when the Speedwell got over, it went into port, had to wait a while for it to get fixed. When it got fixed, then the Speedwell and the Mayflower went on its merry way, but as it went on its merry way, guess what? Speedwell sprung a leak again. So they had to go back in to port, wait, and get it repaired again. So at that point, then they're ready to go again. Speedwell and Mayflower are heading out again. They get about 300 miles offshore. It leaked again. So they had to turn back, go into port, and at that point they said, I ain't going on that ship. You know, that may leak out in the middle of the ocean. So they decided to put the Speedwell aside, but they have a little problem. They've got this group of people with their supplies that they're all going over that are 2 ships worth, and now they only have 1 ship. So they had to make a decision that some of those people had to stay behind. And the rest that were going all crammed onto this ship, many, many more than it was capable of holding. As a matter of fact, there were 102 men, women, and children that went on the trip, and approximately 30 sailors that went. And in that group, there were 24 family units, and that's what was unique about the Plymouth colony. Because if you look at the Virginia colony and some of the other colonies, they were all men that went over, and they went over in order to make money or pick up gold or do whatever. But this was different. These were families that went over, and they went over not looking for profit, they were looking to establish a nation and to evangelize a nation. But of this 102, only 52 of them were separatists. That's another misconception that we have, is that all the passengers of the Mayflower were these pilgrims. No, they weren't. Only 52 of them were actually separatists. And the rest were what they called strangers. That was the name for the non-separatists. They were the strangers. And also they were indentured servants that went along as well. So their journey, which was supposed to take 3 weeks, became 66 days. The first half of the journey, no problem at all. It was pretty calm and everything, although they dealt with seasickness quite a bit. But the second half of the journey, they hit these North Atlantic storms, which just, was severe. And but during this time, these 102 people were confined below decks most of the time, because if you come up above decks, then you're either going to get in the way of the other sailors, or you're going to be washed overboard. And if you're washed overboard, you're dead, because most of them couldn't swim, and it takes an awful lot of effort to turn a big sailing ship around and to come around and pick you up. They just won't do it. You fall overboard and they go, bye-bye. So you didn't want to go up on the upper decks unless it was really calm and you were given permission. So they were below decks, and they were crammed into an area, 102 of them, in a space no larger than a volleyball court. That's how tight they were. Can you imagine 66 days that way? And keep in mind that they were already on the ship about 6 weeks before this started, because of all the repairs to the Speedwell and such. The ceiling was so low that very few of them could actually stand up. So 66 days walking like this, from one place to another. In addition to that, all their belongings, their supplies, a few chickens and a couple dogs, and a 30-foot boat were all in this area as well. They had no privacy in their times of sickness and personal matters. They did build simple wood dividers that they kind of nailed together to provide a very small amount of privacy, but it wasn't much. They had no bathroom. The sailors went to the bathroom up on the front of the boat on the head, but there was no way the ladies and children were going to go up there, let alone the men weren't either. And so they had to go to the bathroom in chamber pots, which is no fun. It's not very private. And if you consider the boat is rocking this way, the boat is rocking that way, you can have a mess going on. So if you can just imagine, see, I'm drawing you in to, if you can imagine the smell and the slippery floor and people getting seasick and that on the floor. And of course, water would splash in, through the grates up on top. And also they were on the gun deck. And so the gun deck has portholes on the side for the guns. And water comes in that way too. So it was a very uncomfortable time. They had no showers or baths. There were actually 3 women on board that were pregnant in their last trimester. Yeah. There was a baby born en route, Oceanus Hopkins, but he died. Another baby was stillborn. But there was a third one, Peregrine White, who was born on board once they arrived at Provincetown Harbor. And he actually survived, and he has many descendants. I had some fun stories to tell you, but I want to be kind of sensitive to the time here. I will tell you one story, though, because it talks about our God. I was talking about how when you fall overboard, you're dead. Well, there was a gentleman named John Howland, and he had had enough below decks. He just couldn't be below decks anymore, and so he went up on deck, and sure enough, he got washed overboard. And, he's a dead man at that point. But because there had been a storm, some of the rigging from the sails was hanging down, and some of the ropes were hanging down, and one of the rope was hanging down over the side of the boat and into the water. And as he was going down for the last time and kind of reaching his arm up like this, the rope slid by his arm, and he happened to catch it. And the boat pulled him for quite a distance until somebody happened to see, hey, there's a person surfing behind our boat. And they finally pulled him in, and sure enough, he survived. And he was, if not the oldest, one of the oldest living, Pilgrim survivors. There was another story where on the adventure, the main beam of the boat cracked. And the main beam is what holds the main mast up. So that breaks, the mast comes down, you're dead in the water, and you're all done. But it so happened, by providence, by God's hand, that there was a screw. They don't describe what the screw is, but they think it was probably like a jack that you put under a house to raise it up if you're doing construction or that type of thing. But they happened to have a screw on board that they were able to get under that main beam and screw it up and bring it up, and were able to repair it enough to make the journey. God's hand was on all of that. Well, I can see that I'm really going on and on. I'm running out of time. So let me see if I can bring some things, more in a nutshell. So they intended to go to the mouth of the Hudson River, which is right about where Jersey City is today. But they got caught in this storm, and they were blown 300 miles to the north. And that creates a problem. Well, I'm a little ahead of myself here. That creates a problem because now they're outside of the jurisdiction of the patent that they're in. And the patent for their colony included rules for creating a government, rules for, laws, law enforcement, all those types of things. But now that they're outside of that jurisdiction, none of that applies anymore. And so now they're a group of people, half of whom are not separatists, on a boat about ready to get off, and they're hearing mumblings. Gee, when we get off of here, we can do whatever we want, and nobody's going to stop us. So before they got off the boat, they created something called the Mayflower Compact. And that Mayflower Compact was basically an agreement that they made to create a government, to allow for leaders to be elected, for laws to be made as was necessary. But this was the first time that we had a voluntary self-government created, where people who created the government voluntarily submitted themselves to that government that they created. And that document became the foundation for our U.S. Constitution and our form of government that we enjoy today. So let's see if I can kind of move ahead here, see where I'm at. Okay. So they actually stepped out of the boat onto Plymouth Rock on Christmas Day of 1620. And when they got there, there had been an Indian village there, but it was empty. There had been a plague 2 years before that had totally wiped out the Indian village. And the other Indian tribes in the area were afraid to come into that area because they were afraid that a great supernatural spirit had actually brought that plague and killed everybody. And so because of that, the Plymouth settlers not only had a great place to put their settlement, but they were also somewhat protected by the Indians who didn't attack them. They didn't see any Indians for the first few months. But it was pretty bleak when they arrived there. And there's the Mayflower Compact. So the first thing they did was they built a common house to put their store, to store their supplies and things. But they also began building houses. But it was in the middle of winter. And it was a nasty winter. And in the first 90 days, half of them died. Of the 18 married women, only 4 of them survived. And the reason for that, they feel, is that the women were the ones who kind of stayed on the Mayflower while the men were building the houses and such. The women stayed on the Mayflower and cared for the sick people. And so you had these close quarters. But also, it's felt that the women, the mothers, paid so much attention to protecting their children and keeping their children warm that they themselves suffered for it. And in fact, of all the children that went on the Mayflower, and there were 27 of them that went, and plus 2 more that were born, out of the 29 children, only 2 of them died. So they were protected. So let's see if I can kind of skip to the end here. Oh, Squanto. Yeah, Squanto was a Indian who had been kidnapped twice to England and Spain. And so he knew English, and he had been taught in the Christian religion. And when he came back home, he was a member of the Patuxet tribe, which was the tribe that was wiped out. So when he came back to his home to join his tribe again after being kidnapped twice, there was nobody there. He was the last one. So he went to live with Chief Massasoit of the Wampanoag tribe. And then when the Pilgrims arrived, because he spoke English and because he had this Christian teaching, he felt a desire to put aside any bitterness that he might have had by the way he was treated by the English and actually help these people to survive where his tribe should have survived. And he greatly helped them. They would not have survived that first winter if it wasn't for his assistance. Bradford said the Squanto was a special instrument sent of God for their good beyond their expectation. And because of Squanto's help and God's provision, they did succeed that first year. The first 90 days were very difficult, but they did succeed. And they actually had a bounty of crops. They knew how to fish take the fish out of the stream, how to collect the eels, how to hunt beaver, how to hunt otter. They learned how to do all kinds of things because of Squanto. And so they had an abundance. And so William Bradford proclaimed a day of Thanksgiving. And in that day of Thanksgiving, which was in November, same time that we have it, the Wampanoag Indians were invited to join the Pilgrims. And some think that perhaps that was kind of an evangelical outreach to these Native Americans. So Chief Massasoit and 90 of his men came and feasted with the Pilgrims for 3 days, and they brought 5 deer to give to the governor. And everybody ate deer, turkey, fish, lobster, eels, vegetables, cornbread, herbs, berries, pies, and all kinds of things. And the Native Americans even taught the Pilgrims how to make popcorn. And they had games, they had wrestling games. And think of this, the settlers with the Indians. This is how good their relationship was. They had running games, wrestling games, shooting games, amongst themselves. I should speak before I finish here to the Native Americans, because a lot of people give the Pilgrims a hard time because they say, oh, those nasty Pilgrims, they came in and, took over the Indians' land and treated them badly and everything else. And certainly there were some, sea captains that came in and treated badly. And the Indians were not always treated correctly. But that's not what the Pilgrims were about. They weren't looking for trouble. They came to start a new life and to bring blessing to their land and eventually to the whole world. The Pilgrims were wise in their diplomacy with the Indians, and they had a high view of the Native Americans. They believed that the Native Americans were made in the image of God, that they were created equal, that they should love their neighbor, and if possible, as much as depends on them, to live peaceable with all men. And they believed in equality under the law. So they sought, with Squanto's help, a long-term peace with their neighbors, with Chief Massasoit and the Wampanoag tribe, and they had a peace treaty that lasted 50 years. As a matter of fact, Edward Winslow says, "We have found the Native Americans very faithful in their covenant of peace with us, very loving and ready to pleasure us. We often go to them and they come to us. Some of us have been 50 miles by land in this country with them. And we, for our parts, walk as peaceably and safely in the wood as in the highways in England. We entertain them as family in our houses, and they as friendly, bestowing their venison on us." That's the type of relationship they had with the Indians. So if you hear things about the Pilgrims, those nasty Pilgrims and, what they did to the Indians, don't you believe it? It's not true. So I'll finish up. Let's see if I can move ahead here. So at the end of Bradford's book, he says, "Thus out of these small beginnings at Plymouth and with the Pilgrims, greater things have been produced by God's hand, which originally made all things out of nothing, and continues to give life and existence to all things that are. And as one small candle may light 1,000 candles, so the light that has been kindled here at Plymouth has shown to many people, yes, in some sort of way, to our whole nation. Let the glorious name of Jehovah have all the praise." So, in reflection, these Pilgrims, they were ordinary people, but there were certain things that made them extraordinary. And this can be a challenge to us, because I know, I'm not always as grateful as I should be. I'm not always as patient, long-suffering, all these things that these guys found so easy to do. So it's a real challenge to me, as I'm sure it's a challenge to you, but it's a real example for us. And these are some of their character qualities that maybe can help stimulate our prayer and stimulate our thought and begin to get us in line with God's will so that we can be these types of Christians as well. They had a providential worldview, which meant that they believed that God was in charge of everything, that God was totally in control of everything, and that history isn't about man, history is about God and his meta-narrative, his big story. And that they were a part of that. They had a destiny, they had a purpose, they had a destiny that they were called to be a part of. They had faith, trust, and hope in God through everything. They had a zeal for God and his liberating truth. They were people of covenant, of commitment to God, but also to each other. They had freedom and joy in being obedient to God's precepts. They didn't see it as a burden or being restricted. It was freedom and joy for them to do so. They had internal government. They were internally governed. They had discipline. They didn't need a lot of rules and regulations to force them to do what was right because they wanted to do what was right from the inside. They had consistent character. They had courage, steadfastness, and faithfulness. They had hard work, diligence, and endurance. They had a love for their families and future generations. They looked beyond their own life to see their impact upon the next generation and the next generation after that, and many generations into the future. And they had a commitment to fulfill their purpose, what God had made them for and called them for. They were committed to fulfilling that in the time that God allowed them to be on this earth. So how are we responding to our extraordinary circumstances? Are we living lives that future generations would reflect upon as being extraordinary? Can we learn from our Pilgrim Fathers' example? What is the Holy Spirit speaking to us right now? And how will we respond? Something I felt that the Lord wanted me to say today, and I don't know if you call it a word from the Lord or prophecy or whatever, but I just really felt that God wanted me to say this. And what it was is, stay true to me and to my truth. In the midst of the trials and tribulations that will come, and they will come, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Be not afraid. I will be with you even as I was with your Pilgrim Fathers. So, would you join me in prayer? Father, we're grateful to you for our Pilgrim Fathers, and we're grateful for their extraordinary lives that you brought out of their ordinary lives. Lord, thank you for the example they set for us. It's such a challenge for us to even think about living that way, and yet it is possible. They've shown that it is. We pray, Holy Spirit, that you would do the transformation in our minds and our hearts so that we can begin to see the world as they see the world, as they saw the world. We can react to the things in this world, the trials and tribulations and the various things, the circumstances that come our way, that we can react in a godly way, in a courageous way, in a hopeful way, in the power of the Holy Spirit. Lord, please work in our hearts, bring that transformation, and then use us, God, for your glory and that very thing that you've made us for and that you've called us to. We give ourselves to you. We submit ourselves to you, Lord, and say, do it. Do it. Whatever it is, Lord, do it in me and through me. In Jesus' name, amen.